I had seen my fair share of ridiculous things on my farm, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the sight of a middle-aged woman in a flowery dress, gripping the handlebars of a bright red Vespa scooter as it fishtailed through my cornfield like a drunk squirrel on roller skates. The engine sputtered, the wheels spun wildly, and with every turn she sank deeper into the mud, her shrieks piercing the morning air. "Help! Help! My scooter is stuck! This is your fault!" she screeched, waving her arms as if that would magically summon assistance. My first instinct was to laugh. I mean, how often do you wake up, step outside with a cup of coffee, and witness someone attempting off-road motocross on an Italian city scooter through rows of carefully grown corn? But then again, this was Karen, the most entitled neighbor to ever curse our quiet farming community. And the fact that she had managed to dig herself into this mess was not just poetic justice, it was downright hilarious. It had only been 2 weeks since she moved into the rental house down the road, and in that short time, she had complained about everything. The smell of manure, the sound of my roosters crowing, the fact that my cows looked at her funny. But her biggest issue? Apparently, my farm was inconveniently placed near her jogging route. And now, as if to solidify her role as the town's biggest nuisance, she had taken it upon herself to cut through my field, convinced that her GPS was more reliable than common sense. I took my sweet time strolling up to where she was stranded, leaning against the wooden fence and watching as her frustration boiled over. She was trying to rock the Vespa back and forth, but all that accomplished was splattering mud up her legs and onto her once pristine white sneakers. "You're trespassing," I finally said, sipping my coffee. She gasped, whipping her head toward me. "Trespassing? No, I am shortcutting. Google Maps shows a road here, so I have every right to use it." I arched an eyebrow. "That's not a road. That's my cornfield." "Then why does it look like a path?" "Because it's where my tractor drives, Karen." She made a dramatic noise, throwing her hands in the air as if I were the unreasonable one. "Well, this is absurd. Why would you plant crops in a place where people might drive through?" "Because it's a farm." Her eyes narrowed, her nostrils flaring. "Well, I demand you get my scooter out of this disgusting mess immediately. I have somewhere to be." I took another sip of coffee, savoring the moment. "I could," I said, dragging the words out slowly. "But that depends." "On what?" she snapped. "On whether or not you finally admit that cutting through my land was a dumb idea." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line, her pride battling against the obvious. She looked down at her Vespa, now tilted at an angle like a sinking ship, the back wheel nearly submerged in the thick mud. She tried once more to rev the engine, but the only result was a wet splurch as more dirt was sucked into the tires. "This is a nightmare," she muttered under her breath. "This thing cost me a fortune." I tilted my head. "Seems like you should have spent some of that fortune on a vehicle meant for, I don't know, actual roads?" Karen huffed and crossed her arms. "I can't believe this. You have to help me. I'll have you know my husband is a lawyer, and if you don't..." I held up a hand. "Karen, your husband doesn't have jurisdiction over my land. And if we're throwing legal terms around, you're the one trespassing. Technically, I could charge you for damages." Her eyes widened as if the concept of facing consequences had never occurred to her. "Damages? But it's just some corn." "Just some corn," I repeated, feigning deep offense. "Karen, do you know how long it takes to grow a healthy cornfield?" She blinked. 4 months. 4 months of planting, watering, weeding, and keeping pests away. And you just flattened a whole row in 20 seconds. If that's not impressive, I don't know what is. She looked over her shoulder at the trail of destruction she had left in her wake. A deep groove ran through my field where her scooter had skidded, several corn stalks crushed beneath the tires. It was as if someone had dragged a rolling pin straight through my livelihood. Karen shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, fine. I may have made a slight miscalculation." I let out a low whistle. "A slight miscalculation?" That's like calling a tornado a light breeze. She shot me a glare. Are you going to help me or not? I sighed, setting my coffee down on a nearby fence post. All right. Let me grab my tractor. Her face instantly lit up, but the moment I started walking toward the barn, she called out, Wait! No. You're not dragging my Vespa out with that beastly thing, are you? I turned back, frowning. Well, how else are we getting it out? You could lift it out. Karen, that thing weighs 100 pounds. You want me to just pick it up like a sack of potatoes? She looked at me expectantly. I stared at her. She was serious. I let out a long sigh, rubbing my temples. You really don't want me using the tractor, huh? No. It'll scratch the paint. I bit the inside of my cheek, thinking. All right, Karen. No tractor. But I do have an alternative. She brightened, clearly relieved. Oh, thank goodness. What is it? I grinned. Daisy. Her brow furrowed. Who's Daisy? I pointed to the pasture behind me. There, standing tall and proud, was Daisy, my biggest, strongest mule. She flicked her ears, lazily chewing on some hay. Karen's expression twisted. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, I said, walking toward Daisy's pen. She's pulled heavier loads than that little scooter of yours. Karen made a strangled noise. No. You are not letting some filthy farm animal touch my Vespa. Then I guess your Vespa stays stuck. She sputtered, glancing between me, the sinking scooter, and the massive mule. Her face twisted with internal conflict. Finally, she groaned, throwing her hands up in defeat. Fine, she snapped. Just get it out. I grinned, grabbing Daisy's harness. You got it. As I led Daisy toward the crime scene, I could barely contain my laughter. Karen had no idea what she had just agreed to. And this? This was only the beginning. Daisy the mule was a professional. She had pulled wagons, hauled sacks of feed, and even dragged a broken-down truck out of the mud once. But today, she was going to do something far more entertaining. She was about to save a very stubborn woman and her very expensive scooter from a mess of her own making. I secured the rope around the Vespa's handlebars, making sure it was tight enough to hold but loose enough not to snap anything important. Karen, still covered in mud and fuming like a kettle on the verge of boiling, hovered over my shoulder, wringing her hands as if sheer nervous energy could keep her scooter intact. You're sure this won't damage it? She asked for the 10th time. As sure as I am that this whole situation is ridiculous, I replied, patting Daisy's side. Karen let out a sharp breath, crossing her arms. This is just unacceptable. I should not have to go through this kind of humiliation. I chuckled, giving Daisy the signal to start moving. Oh, I think you should. Consider it a life lesson. Daisy took a strong step forward, the rope pulling taut as the Vespa groaned under the strain. The back wheel lifted slightly before sinking back into the mud. Karen let out a horrified gasp, clutching her chest like she had just watched a priceless work of art go up in flames. Careful! That's an imported vehicle, she shrieked. You don't say, I muttered, trying to hide my smirk. Daisy gave another strong tug, and the Vespa lurched forward, the back tire finally coming unstuck. Unfortunately for Karen, the sudden movement sent a fresh wave of mud flying, directly at her face. There was a wet splatter, a moment of silence, and then a high-pitched shriek as she stumbled backward, sputtering and flailing. I bit my tongue so hard I almost drew blood. Laughing now would definitely get me sued. Karen wiped at her face, her expensive sunglasses now coated in brown sludge. This is disgusting. I look like, I can't even say it. I pretended to examine her. Well, if I had to guess, I'd say you look like someone who just learned not to drive a Vespa through a cornfield. She glared at me, her face still dripping. You are enjoying this, aren't you? A little bit, I admitted, giving Daisy a congratulatory pat as she finally freed the scooter from the worst of the mud. The Vespa now sat on solid ground, though it was far from the pristine piece of machinery it had been before Karen's little adventure. Mud was caked into every crevice, the wheels were coated in dirt, and the seat had a suspicious-looking splatter of something I didn't even want to identify. Karen gasped in horror, rushing to her scooter. "It's ruined. Ruined." I tilted my head. "It's a little dirty, sure. But it still runs, right?" She turned the key in the ignition. The Vespa gave a sickly cough before stalling out. Karen let out a sound somewhere between a groan and a scream. "This is your fault," she snapped. "Remind me how? If your farm wasn't so poorly maintained, I wouldn't have gotten stuck in the first place." I let out a slow, deliberate breath, counting to 5 in my head to keep from saying something that would land me in trouble. "Karen, let me ask you something. If you walked into someone's house uninvited, spilled coffee on yourself, and then blamed them for putting a couch in your way, how do you think that would go?" She blinked at me. "That's not the same thing at all." "It's exactly the same thing," I said, pointing at the damaged field behind her. "You cut through my property without permission, got yourself stuck, and now you want to act like this is somehow my responsibility?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Clearly, the logic was hitting her brain at a pace slower than molasses in winter. "This isn't over," she finally muttered, pulling her phone from her mud-soaked purse. "I'm calling the sheriff." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, please do." She hesitated, clearly expecting me to back down. When I didn't, she pressed the call button with an exaggerated flourish and lifted the phone to her ear. "Yes, hello? Sheriff? I need to report a crime." I snorted. This was about to be real good. A few minutes later, Sheriff Tom's cruiser rolled up the dirt road, kicking up dust as it came to a stop near the field. Sheriff Tom was a man who had dealt with all kinds of nonsense in our small town, but even he wasn't prepared for what he saw when he stepped out of his car. He took in the scene. The muddy Vespa, Karen covered in filth, Daisy standing proudly beside me like she had just won a blue ribbon at the county fair. He let out a long, weary sigh, as if already regretting getting out of bed that morning. "All right," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "What happened?" Karen launched into a dramatic retelling, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and a voice that cracked on cue whenever she described the horrors of being stranded in a wasteland of dirt and vegetables. I waited patiently for her to finish, then gestured toward the deep tire tracks in my field. "She cut through my land without permission," I said simply. Sheriff Tom glanced at the evidence, then back at Karen. "Ma'am, is this true?" She huffed. "I was following GPS. It said there was a road here." Sheriff Tom gave her a long, unimpressed look. "Ma'am, you're standing in a cornfield." Karen flailed her arms. "I demand that he pays for the damage to my scooter." Sheriff Tom sighed. "Actually, ma'am, you're the one who trespassed and damaged his crops. If anything, you owe him money." Karen's face turned several shades of red. "That is outrageous. You mean to tell me that after everything I've been through, I'm the one in trouble?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Sheriff Tom said, already pulling out his notepad. Karen sputtered. I will not stand for this." "Then sit," I offered helpfully. She turned on me so fast I thought her head might spin right off her shoulders. "You think this is funny?" "Very," I admitted. Sheriff Tom let out another sigh. "Look, I'm not going to arrest anyone today. But I am going to suggest you apologize, pay for the damages, and maybe, just maybe, reconsider using a Vespa as an all-terrain vehicle." Karen's jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might shatter. But with the sheriff watching, she had no choice but to grit out a forced, barely audible, "Sorry." I leaned in. "What was that?" I didn't quite hear. Her eye twitched. "I said sorry." "Apology accepted," I said cheerfully. "Now, about that payment for my corn." Karen groaned, throwing her head back like a teenager being asked to do chores. But she had no way out. And as Sheriff Tom wrote down her information, I smiled to myself. This had turned out to be a very good day. Karen sulked as she scribbled out a check, her hand moving like she was signing away her soul rather than just paying for a few crushed corn stalks. I leaned casually against the fence, watching the struggle play out on her face. Every now and then, she would glance at her mud-covered Vespa, let out a little whimper, and then scowl at me as if this entire situation had been my grand scheme all along. Sheriff Tom stood nearby, arms crossed, doing his best to keep a neutral expression, though I could see the corners of his mouth twitching. Even he was having a hard time holding back his amusement. Karen ripped the check from the book with the aggression of someone trying to tear reality itself apart. She practically threw it at me. There. Happy now? I examined it slowly, making a show of holding it up to the light. I suppose this will do. Karen groaned, running her hands through her mud-streaked hair. I just want to leave this godforsaken place. I gestured to her Vespa, still covered in a thick layer of dirt and grass. Be my guest. Although, I'd recommend hosing that thing down before you try riding it unless you want to be permanently glued to the seat. She stomped toward the scooter, shaking her head in absolute disbelief at how her day had spiraled into this mess. With great reluctance, she straddled it and turned the key. The engine sputtered weakly, coughed out a sad little puff of smoke, and died. Karen froze, her jaw tightening as she tried again. Same result. Again. Nothing. I folded my arms, watching. That's unfortunate. Karen whipped around, eyes burning. Fix it. I let out a low whistle. Karen, I'm a farmer, not a mechanic. You did this, she accused, pointing a shaking finger at me. I raised an eyebrow. I'm pretty sure you did this when you plowed through my field like it was the Daytona 500. Sheriff Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. Ma'am, you're gonna have to call a tow or a mechanic. Karen's nostrils flared. I don't need a tow. I just need this ridiculous thing to start. She tried again, twisting the throttle aggressively. This time, the Vespa made a noise somewhere between a dying cat and a chainsaw before lurching forward half a foot, just enough to send Karen toppling sideways into a fresh puddle of mud. There was silence. A long, beautiful silence. Then, from across the fence, Daisy the mule let out what could only be described as a chuckle. I lost it. I doubled over, laughing so hard my ribs hurt. Sheriff Tom had to turn away to hide his face, his shoulders shaking. Even my dog, Max, who had been lounging nearby, let out a low, amused whine. Karen, on the other hand, lay sprawled in the mud, her fists clenched, her eyes wide with horror. That's it, she whispered, pushing herself up slowly. I am done with this nightmare town. She ripped off her muddy sunglasses, flung them to the ground, and stormed off down the dirt road, leaving her Vespa abandoned like a wounded soldier. Sheriff Tom watched her go, shaking his head. You gonna keep that as a trophy? He asked, nodding toward the scooter. I smirked. Nah. I'll have Hank from the auto shop pick it up. Maybe he can salvage something out of it. We watched as Karen disappeared over the hill, still muttering angrily to herself. Sheriff Tom let out a long breath. I give it 2 weeks before she moves out. Generous estimate, I said, wiping tears of laughter from my eyes. Turns out I was right. 2 weeks later, the for rent sign went up in front of Karen's house. No warning, no goodbye, just a silent retreat in the dead of night. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. My farm, at last, was at peace again. To celebrate, I invited some friends and neighbors over for a good old-fashioned farm cookout. The grill was fired up, the tables were stacked with food, and, as a final tribute to Karen's legacy, I made sure the menu featured nothing but corn-based dishes. Corn on the cob, cornbread, corn fritters, corn chowder, you name it. People laughed and shared stories, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. The highlight of the evening was when Old Man Murphy, who had lived in town longer than anyone, raised a toast. To Karen, he said, raising his glass of sweet tea. May she never find her way back. The crowd erupted into cheers. Just as I was taking a bite of some perfectly buttered corn, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching down my dirt road. I turned, my stomach dropping slightly. A car was approaching. The laughter around me quieted as people followed my gaze. It wasn't Karen. No, her reign of terror was over. But this car was unfamiliar, a shiny black SUV rolling to a stop just outside my fence. A man stepped out, dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt. He adjusted his sunglasses, looking around with the kind of expression that screamed, "I don't belong here." Then, just as I was about to ask what he wanted, he pulled something out of his pocket. A golf club. I narrowed my eyes. No. It couldn't be. "Excuse me," the man called, his voice smooth, overly polite. "I was just wondering if this was the property that borders Maple Creek? My GPS says there's a golf course here, but all I see are crops." A long silence stretched over the yard. I stared at him. My neighbors stared at him. Even the cows in the field stopped chewing and stared at him. Then, slowly, I stood up, brushing the dust from my hand. "Buddy," I said, "you might want to rethink where you're standing right now." The man frowned, looking around. "So there's not a golf course?" I inhaled deeply, choosing my words carefully. "No. There is not." "Oh," he said, rubbing his chin. "Well, that's strange. My GPS definitely led me here." I glanced at Sheriff Tom, who had also noticed the growing pattern of people relying way too much on technology and way too little on common sense. "You're new in town, huh?" I asked. The man nodded. "Just moved into a rental down the road." "Of course." I turned back to my guests, shaking my head. "Well, folks, looks like we got a fresh one." A groan rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Not again." Sheriff Tom sighed, already pulling out his notepad. "All right," he mumbled, "let's get this over with." The man still looked confused. "Wait, did I say something wrong?" I clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Not yet. But give it time." The guy blinked. The cows mooed. Daisy flicked her tail. And just like that, I knew my peaceful days were over. Again.